The Paradox Legion, Star-Forged Empire, Omni Tempore, Book 1, written by C.E. Foltz, narrated by Benjamin Fife. This book is dedicated to Andrew, who plays our party timecaster, Drusus. Congratulations on winning the book dedication initiative role with a dirty 20. Forward. Content notes. Contains depictions of suicide by the main point of view character, as well as a secondary character and their suicide note. Contains depictions of death as the point of view experience, including burning, drowning, impalement, cut throat, broken neck, and stabbing. Contains graphic violence, including the stabbing of and injury to eyes. Chapter 1. For Tidus' entire life, he had been playing a high-stakes game of chess against his father. Every conversation was a moving of the pieces, his father always watching, waiting for him to learn, to make the next move, to prove that he could be more than just a copper-cut soldier, that he could be worthwhile. Now they were entering the endgame. Tidus straightened, stretching against the back of his chair with a series of loud pops from his spine. The slowly rising sun filtered through the stained glass windows that stretched from floor to ceiling, bathing the shelves of books and cases of old scrolls in a patchwork of light. 3 months of sleepless studying, and he almost had a functional proposal to present to the university board. With his 17th birthday approaching, it was his last chance to prove himself academically before getting shipped off to basic cadet training. "Are you done working yet?" Ilaria's pink eyes popped up behind the edge of his comm screen, wide and imploring. "Not really." Tidus reached over and tousled her dark curls, eliciting a giggle from his younger sister. "But I can take a quick break. Probably should before my brain melts out my ears." Ilaria brightened and grabbed his hand. "You've been working so much. You have to be done soon, right?" "I won't have much choice," Tidus said. "If I don't finish in 6 weeks, it won't matter at all." In 6 weeks, if he hadn't gained acceptance to the Dawn Luster University, his fate would be sealed with his military entrance form, sentenced to an existence of mediocrity in the eyes of his father. "The Empire will never run out of soldiers, but it can never have enough geniuses," his father's favorite saying. One of the countless ways he would remind Tidus that he merely found him acceptable. Certainly not someone his father would ever speak about, with the pride he afforded his oldest son, Kiun, or the tender praise he gave to Ilaria, the youngest at 10 years old and only daughter. "Will you have to live at the university like Kiun after you get in?" Ilaria asked, dangling from his arm as she swung it back and forth. "That's the idea." Ilaria pushed out her lower lip in a pout. "But I'll miss you." "You'll miss me a lot more if I go off to basic training, you know." Tidus shook his head. Ilaria wrinkled her nose in distaste at her options. Tidus didn't blame her. Once he left, she would be alone at the estate with their parents. When Kiun had moved to the university, he had left a gaping hole in the estate, where Tidus used to have someone to sneak out to the glass dunes with. But he still had Ilaria. When Tidus left, she would have no one. Tidus' comm screens flashed from the table, a call alert pinging into the quiet of the library. He shook Ilaria off of his arm and picked it up, swiping over the icon to answer the call. Kiun's face filled the screen, straight dark hair combed back out of his face and red irises enlarged behind the square frames of his glasses. Aside from the glasses, he was like a taller, stretched-out version of Tidus. "I didn't expect a call from you today," Tidus said. "Shouldn't you be getting ready for the Cybermed Lab unveiling ceremony?" "I have that well in hand, but I thought I should let you know about a change that just appeared on my schedule." Tidus frowned. Oh? It seems I have a meeting this afternoon, after the lab ceremony. Kyun glanced around as he spoke, like he was checking for eavesdroppers. Tidus quickly did the same, but his parents had not materialized in the library in the past minute. A meeting with the entire university board, actually, Kyun said. And you? Tidus sucked in a breath. Your proposal presentation is today. Tidus swallowed hard. His father was trying to checkmate him, to catch him unprepared as some kind of twisted test, as if giving him adequate time to prepare was somehow cheating. At least he had Kyun on his side. His help and encouragement were one thing he never had to fight for. If he didn't have that, he would have drowned under their father's expectations years ago. All right, Tidus said. Thanks. He probably wasn't planning to tell me until the board was already assembled. Yeah, that's what I figured, Kyun said, shaking his head. But hey, you've got this. Your idea is solid. Your research is sound. Remember to sound confident, even when they throw questions at you. You don't have to have all the answers yet. It's a proposal for you to explore, not a full-fledged solution to immediately implement. Spin your answers to questions like that, and it'll impress them. Might even impress him. Right, got it. I gotta go. See you soon. The screen blinked off, and Tidus sat back down. He rubbed his hands over the slick fabric of his suit pants, his palms sliding with the layer of sweat, and tried to banish the nerves that trembled in his fingertips. He was already dressed for the ceremony, of course. He wouldn't have suspected anything until moments before the meeting, if not for Kyun's warning. I guess that means you have to keep working, Ilaria said. Her dark cheeks were flushed in frustration, and she crossed her arms. Why does Dad always want you two to be so boring? It's not that boring, really, Tidus said. He opened his research back up. He had thought he would have weeks, or at least days, to practice his proposal. Now he had only hours, and half of those would be taken up with the shuttle ride and the ceremony. It was now or never. See, there are new planets being embraced into the Empire all the time, and after they're embraced, it takes on average 5 to 10 years for there to be even one Dawn Luster University candidate found, sometimes longer. Which means that the best and brightest of them aren't surviving the initial turmoil that comes after the invitation to join the Empire. Ilaria groaned and sank into the chair across from him, hugging a silk throw pillow to her stomach and giving him a poisonous look. But she stayed, however begrudgingly. She might find this entirely boring, but Tidus was glad she would give him even the most reluctant audience. It was much easier than practicing to an empty room. That indicates there is immeasurable potential being lost in the transition process, Tidus said. He stood from his chair so he could get into the presentation mindset properly. He rolled his shoulders and squared his posture to project confidence. One hand reached up to his head, pressing down the occasional rebellious curl that tried to escape his mostly orderly, straight hair. My proposal is to explore methods of scouting planets ahead of embracing them into the Empire. If we are able to find university-worthy minds ahead of time, we can keep them out of the crossfire, and this is also likely to simplify the embracing process altogether, since these are the kinds of people capable of complicating it in the first place. You shouldn't say if when you want them to take you seriously, Ilaria mumbled, folding her flowy lilac sleeve into tiny sections. Right, good point. Tidus tapped the note into his comms screen. He had to present confidence, present value, to make this worth everyone's time. By the time Iris, the estate AI, told them it was time to join their parents at the shuttle bay, Tidus had made it halfway through his presentation. It was too long-winded. He needed to condense it down and focus on the most important pieces of information. He would have to figure that out on the way to the university. Ilaria grabbed his hand as they headed out of the library and down the marble halls of the estate. "Hey, Ilaria," Tidus said in a mock whisper. She looked up at him. "Don't tell Dad I know about the meeting. I want it to be a surprise." Ilaria grinned conspiratorially and nodded, her curls bouncing vigorously around her shoulders. His parents stood at the entrance to the shuttle when Tidus and Ilaria arrived. His father stood tall and imposing, everything from his face to his black suit made out of sharp angles and harsh lines, while his mother's silvery gown flowed like water, perfectly matching the metallic shine of her hair braided into a crown. On the shuttle, Tidus' mind ran through his research, picking apart the statistics, the previous attempts to scout planets the way he proposed, and the different strategies he had come up with that were impossible before. The Krellians, a race of shape-changers, had been embraced into the Empire only 5 years ago, and they opened up an entire new level of possibility. He just had to focus on how this would benefit the Empire, and why his proposal was different from others before him. Tidus caught himself chewing his lip and stopped, stealing a glance at his father. Hopefully he hadn't noticed. The nervous habit was unbecoming of the son of a baron, and definitely did not project an air of confidence. Showing his nerves or succumbing to panic before the meeting would destroy any chances he had. It might even get the entire thing called off. If his father decided he was too weak or pathetic, he would never get to present his idea at all. The shuttle landed lightly on the grassy field outside the university, and Tidus stood to follow his parents off. Ilaria took his hand and squeezed it tightly. His parents strode confidently, regally through the parting crowd. Their security detail fell into step around the family, keeping the crowds of civilians at a respectable distance. There were more people here today than usual. Families of students and doctors from across Dothara had been invited for the unveiling of the Cybermed lab. The ceremony itself would be broadcast to various locations at the university campus to accommodate the crowds in attendance. But Tidus and his family made their way to the main hall. It would be a lecture hall for medical students after today. The stage and chairs on it were draped in velvet, places for the Antirrhinum and Calyx families, and the instructors who had been invited to speak. A podium of dark oak stood at the center. The seats of the audience were already full when Tidus took his place next to Ilaria, one seat left empty between himself and his father for Kiun to take after he addressed the crowd. Tidus sat stiffly, gazing out over the masses while carefully avoiding looking anyone in the eye. Beside him, Ilaria sat with graceful contentment, perfectly at ease in front of a crowd. Tidus wished his presentation could have been on any other day, any day when that would have been the only time he had to be up in front of people. But that was probably part of the point. His father wanted to see him at his most rattled. Tidus gave a silent prayer of thanks for Kiun's warning. He would have been doomed without it, and once his proposal was accepted, Tidus refused to think about the alternative. He would be at the university more than at home. Kiun was much easier to be around. The gentle murmuring of the crowd hushed, and Tidus resisted the urge to turn around in his seat as he heard the back panel slide open. Kiun and Jade Calyx, a tall Arindin with purple and gray feathers, walked onto the stage, the perfectly poised pair of university heirs, Kiun to take charge of the student acquisition, and Jade to oversee the instruction itself. Kiun approached the podium, catching Tidus and Ilaria's gaze with a quick smile as he walked past, then squared his shoulders to the crowd. "We welcome all who have come today," Kiun said, his voice ringing out confidently through the speakers of the university, "to the grand unveiling of the Artesian Cybermed Lab, which stands at the forefront of—" The sound system stuttered, static filling the room. Kiun frowned and glanced to the side with a questioning brow raised. Tidus followed Kiun's gaze with a frown. The answer was lost when the world around them exploded, a wave of flame engulfing the stage. Screams echoed around him, muffled behind a sharp ringing in his ears. Tidus choked on the thick black smoke, his vision smeared with the heat and fumes. He could hear Ilaria sobbing, struggling for air, and tried to move towards her. Blood dripped from his shoulder, hissing on impact with the searing metal of the floor. Tidus dragged himself towards the sounds of Ilaria's cries. Then it stopped. He couldn't hear her anymore. Tidus' blood turned to ice, and he collapsed to the floor. Flames swarmed in on him, licking his skin and sizzling his spilled blood. Chapter 2. Sand coated the inside of Tidus' mouth and stung his eyes, grating roughly over his skin. Every movement sent pain searing through his nerves, like he was burning from the inside out. No, was he burning from the outside in? Sand dug into his skin, trying to crumble him to ash. The smell of smoke filled his lungs, and Tidus wheezed, hacking and gasping for air. Every inch of him was scorching. How did he get here? Where was his family? Where was he? His skull was splitting with pain, pounding and pulsing like something was trying to hatch from inside his brain. The throbbing morphed until it almost sounded like words. No, it was words, just out of reach. Heartbeat. Just like the breaking of surface tension on water, the words spilled into his ears. Focus on your heartbeat. That's it. The voice was familiar, but Tidus couldn't place it. As the words repeated, his pulse reverberated in his ears, suddenly too loud to ignore. His heart pounded against his ribcage like it wanted to break free. Tidus drew in a slow breath, painfully grating against the sand that permeated everything and coated his throat, and held the air in his lungs. He released it gradually as the cadence of his heart slowed. "There you go. Keep breathing," the voice said. The pressure of a hand landed gently on Tidus' shoulder. Tidus flinched violently, and the hand withdrew, but it left an imprint of searing pain in its wake. He took another deep breath. He needed to calm down, to figure out what was going on. As his heart slowed and his senses cleared, he could tell he wasn't actually burning. His body was intact. So why did everything hurt so much? Tidus coughed and pushed himself upright, shakily getting to his feet. When had he fallen? Had he ever been standing? He rubbed his arm over his eyes and opened them, blinking against the light of... no, not sunlight. There was no sun. His gaze roamed the landscape around him. Sand. Unsurprising in itself, but what was surprising was how alien it was. It wasn't the glittering red desert of Rothzura. This sand was white, like dunes of salt, as far as he could see, and the sky was a massive, blank expanse of dull gray. No clouds, no sun, no stars. Just light emanating unsettlingly from every inch of the strange, depthless ceiling. A tremor began in Tidus' knees and spread until his entire body was shaking like a leaf. He turned to face the owner of the uncannily familiar voice, and his gaze met a pair of just as familiar ruby-red eyes. A brow furrowed in concern, dark complexion, framed by straight black hair. Kyun? Tidus' entire body sagged in relief. He had been so sure. What? Why was the thought of Kyun tied to anguish and horror? Why did trying to remember make his skin sting with that same burning? No, I'm not Kyun, the familiar man said, straightening to stand head and shoulders above Tidus. So similar to Kyun. But now that Tidus took a step back to really look at him, it wasn't his brother at all. Kyun was bookish, there was no two ways about it, and whoever this was looked rugged and muscular. Faint scars lined his hands and neck, and the robe he was wearing. With a start, Tidus realized he was wearing the same one. It was silky, but heavy and thick around his body, black and blood red accented with gold. The sleeves hung down over his hands, like he was wearing the same size of robe as the man standing in front of him, and it was definitely not tailored for his 16-year-old frame. "I'm going to explain some things, all right? But it's going to be a lot to take in," the man said, "especially because you should have some memories start to come back shortly. Just try not to panic." "It's, a little late for that," Tidus stammered, suddenly glad for the overly large robe to hide the shaking in his hands. He balled them into fists and crossed his arms. That made him look even more like a child wearing his father's bathrobe, so he dropped his arms back to his sides immediately. "Who are you? Where are we? How did I get here?" Each question made his breath hitch, and his heart started to race again. The man raised his hands in a calming gesture towards Tidus, and he took a few more deep breaths. "I can answer all of those," he said, the calm in his voice suddenly annoying. "Well, okay, maybe I should start with where we are." "Just start somewhere," Tidus snapped. He almost apologized, but shut his mouth to stop it. There was a time and place for etiquette. This was the time and place for answers. "All right," the man said, a flicker of a smile tugging at his face, so fast Tidus thought he could have imagined it. The image of that same look on his father's face sent a spike of pain through his skull. "This place is an in-between, a waiting space. It's not anywhere on any map, and time doesn't really pass while we're here. Not really. Most of us who know about it call it the timescape." "In between what?" Tidus asked, his mind twirling around the nonsense he was being told. It only amplified the nerves clawing at his skin. Waiting for what? That doesn't make any sense. "I know. It's hard to get at first," the man said with a sigh. "It's in between everything, basically. It's just a non-place." Tidus groaned and rubbed his palms into his eyes. He desperately searched his memories, trying to remember how he got here, but found only dark shadows. Where had he been before? What had he been doing? Why did the memory he couldn't quite reach fill him with such dread? He remembered practicing his presentation, the shuttle ride to the university, and then... what? "All right, I should probably start with answering a question you didn't even know to ask," the man said. "Tidus, you can do things not everyone can. Most people actually can't do what we can do. Even now, without knowing how to harness it, that's why you're here. Most people never get to see the timescape." Tidus caught on the words. His thoughts stuttered to a halt, then sped up in double time around him. "What kinds of things?" Tidus asked in a hoarse whisper. He swallowed and tried again. "What do you mean? Please, what is this place really?" There was a look in the man's eyes that Tidus couldn't name. Something complicated. There was warmth there and encouragement, but something hesitant as well. Something nervous. The man nodded, red eyes locked on him. "You're getting there," he said softly. "You know what this place is. Focus. Pay attention. What do you feel?" Tidus clenched and unclenched his fists, shaking particles of sand off his fingers. How was there still sand left to shake off? His breath caught in his chest as he tried to do as the man said. Focus. What did he feel? The grains of sand against his skin. No, it wasn't sand. Tidus had spent enough nights stargazing from the Shirdanian dunes. The feeling of sand on his fingers was familiar. This wasn't it. It was too fine to be sand. It almost seemed to dissolve on his skin, like sugar, leaving a sticky residue. But that wasn't right either. These particles were in the air, too, but more substantial than dust. The realization crashed in on Tidus as he realized why this knot place, with the knot sand, felt so unnaturally stagnant, or maybe in constant motion that Tidus couldn't perceive. "It's time," Tidus breathed, eyes widening. The particles against his skin hummed as if to confirm it. Heartbeats, seconds, moments. This place. What? How? "Time," the man repeated, a mournful smile on his lips. "Yeah, that's the answer to all your questions, really. This place, it's time. Or the sand is, anyway. The timescape is where time isn't passing, isn't moving, like it's just kind of waiting for us. We come here when we've—" "No!" The word burst out of Tidus so suddenly it surprised him. Memories crashed in on him, tumbling through his mind. The shuttle ride to the university, Kiyun's speech at the new Cybermed lab. No, please! Light of Prometheus, this can't be happening. Pain, fire, burning, the sizzling of his skin, flames and sparks searing his body. Tidus crumpled to the ground, wrapping his arms around his head. The smothering feeling of smoke filled his lungs, coated them like tar. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't scream. He could only hear the roaring flames. He could only hear the screams. Ilaria's had stopped first. She was so little. Everything around him was frantic, trapped. There was no way out. Tidus knew how he got to the timescape. He had died. Burned to death alongside his family and everyone in attendance at the ceremony. Everything was gone. "Breathe, kid." The man's voice cut through the violent aftershocks of memory. Tidus lay in the knot sand, his eyes staring vacantly at the knot sky. "Breathe. I know it's terrible. Trust me, I know." Tidus blinked and focused his gaze on the man, crouched above him with concern etched into all of his so familiar features. Familiar, and at the same time strange. A face he knew intimately, yet had never looked at before, not like this. "Who are you?" Tidus asked. He knew the answer. He could feel it hanging in the air like sandy particles. "You're a smart kid," the man said, a little sadly. "You probably have it figured out, but yes, I am Tidus Antirrhinum." Tidus nodded and closed his eyes. Of course. It wasn't his brother here, just himself, some other, older version of himself? A manifestation from the timescape itself? He wasn't sure. Are they really? Tidus tried to form the question, his voice shaking and tears burning his eyes. He forced them open to look blearily at the other him, the not Tidus. "Look, however you got here," the not Tidus said gently, carefully avoiding the word died. "It did really happen. But hey, look at me. We get to try again. That's what the timescape is for. We get a do-over. Every time. When you get out of here, you'll wake up back before it all happened. And you get to change things." Tidus bolted upright, almost smacking his head on not Tidus' face, on his way to his feet. "I can go back? I can save them?" he asked, urgency rushing through his veins like a drug. He grabbed the front of not Tidus' robes, knuckles white with desperation. "How?" "Calm down, I can tell you," not Tidus said, the calm in his voice sending a bolt of anger through Tidus. "You've got to pay attention, because we don't have much time." "What?" Tidus released not Tidus' robes, wringing his hands. "I thought you said time didn't pass here." He had to get out of here. "Yeah, well, it doesn't," not Tidus said, sighing. "But there isn't really a word for what we don't have. If you stay here too long, you start to lose things, like your memories, attachments. You'll lose your grip on reality. I can't lose them. I can't forget them, Tidus said, failing to suck air into his lungs. His fingers went numb, and he rubbed his hands together. Tell me how to get back. Okay, listen closely. Not Tidus put his hands on Tidus' shoulders. Sand isn't the only way that time manifests here. The way back is through the water. You have to get fully submerged, then breathe it in. It'll feel like you're drowning, because you kind of are. You're re-entering the flow of time, you know? Well, you'll figure it out. Where is the water? Tidus gasped. He blinked, trying to clear his vision, and scanned the horizon for any sign of the water. It had to be there. He had to get out of here. He couldn't lose everything. He couldn't let them die. I'll show you. But first, just listen. I wish I could explain everything, but for now, pay attention. I know this feels bad, but it's going to get worse. Not if I can save them. Tidus realized he was shouting, but couldn't stop. Let me go back. We're going. Not Tidus grabbed his shoulder and started pulling him along. Tidus stumbled and put his feet back underneath him as they walked. Now pay attention. When you wake up, it's going to hurt. A lot. You'll feel like you're dying again, but you won't be. And there won't be anything wrong, so nobody will be able to help. But it will fade. You will be able to handle it. Got it? I know you can. You're me, after all. Tidus nodded, swallowing a wave of nausea and trying not to think about what would happen if he vomited into the actual concept of time. He had enough to worry about without that. The most important thing is to remember why you're doing this, Not Tidus said. Remember why it matters, what makes it worth it. If you hold on to that, you'll be okay. Tidus nodded. He was doing it to save his family, to protect them. It would be worth it. He blinked, and a crystalline expanse of water appeared in front of him. A sea, like the one back home, but perfectly still, like a mirror, unearthly. This is it, Not Tidus said. Remember, breathe in the water. Let yourself drown. Got it? Tidus nodded, then stepped into the water before he could lose his nerve. He had to go, before he forgot why it mattered. He let the water rise up over his head, fought all his instincts, and breathed in, letting the water fill his lungs. The heavy weight of it dragged him down. Blackness shuddered over his vision, pulling him back into the flow of time. Chapter 3. Tidus woke to the sound of screaming, jagged and raw, and yet it was only a fraction as painful as the blistering sensation over every inch of his skin. He flailed and fell to the floor of the shuttle. The screaming finally stopped when he sucked in a breath of air. The floor of the shuttle against his palms and knees burned. Tidus, what's wrong? His mother's voice stabbed through the haze in his mind, and then her arms were around him. Agony. Tidus flinched away violently. Remember why you're doing this. Tidus tried to breathe slowly, deeply, even as every movement sent another wave of pain through him. He clenched his eyes shut. He had to focus. He had to control himself. He wasn't dying. He was alive. He was alive, and so was his family. He had to get a hold of himself if he wanted to keep it that way. Tidus gulped in air and forced himself to focus through the torment, through the phantoms of flame licking at every level of his flesh. Tidus, are you all right? His father knelt beside him but didn't touch him. That was good. It helped. Try to breathe, son. What is it? Turn the shuttle around, Tidus gasped. We have to. We can't go to the university. What? His father's expression twisted from concern to confusion with a hint of suspicion. "Please," Tidus pleaded. "Please, we can't go. And Kiun, he has to come home. If he doesn't, if we go, we'll all die. We all died." His father stared at him, completely silent. Only Tidus' shuddering breaths echoed through the shuttle. "What do you mean?" the Baron asked. "Breathe, then try to explain." "I lived it. I was there. We were there for the ceremony," Tidus stammered, trying to explain, but it barely made sense to him. How could he make his father understand? "I don't know what happened, but there was a fire and an explosion. We were trapped, and then the sand. I was dead, and—" His father sucked in a gasp, and Tidus stopped, looking at him. A look crossed his father's face he had never seen before. At least, never directed at him. Something like astonishment and awe. Something about what Tidus had said made sense, and the look in his father's eyes was respect. Tidus blinked, but the look was still there. "Iris," his father barked, activating the AI assistant. "Cancel our current destination. Return the shuttle to the Antirrhinum estate immediately." "Of course, sir," Iris responded. "Would you like me to alert the university that we won't be arriving as scheduled?" "Yes," his father said. "And contact Kiun Antirrhinum. Tell him to cancel the ceremony today and return to the estate immediately as well." "Contacting Kiun Antirrhinum." "It's going to be all right, Tidus." His father reached out and put a hand on Tidus' shoulder. Tidus cringed away. It was like every nerve in his body was exposed. Every touch was pain. "Please, don't touch me," he whimpered. "It hurts." He hated how his voice sounded, but he could do nothing to change it. He wanted his father's embrace so badly, but he couldn't stand the physical contact. He took another deep breath. It would be worth it, because his family would be alive, and the look in his father's eyes, that pride. Tidus took it to his heart and let it spread through his veins, pushing back the memory of death. Something ached, and every time he blinked, he saw the burning images of his family. But it was worth it for the look in his father's eyes. He was finally something more than a redundancy in the bloodline, a spare to his brother as heir. "I am currently unable to contact Kiun Antirrhinum," Iris' voice interrupted. Tidus' father cursed and stood, storming to the control panel on the wall and barking for everyone to give Tidus space. Tidus scooted back towards the wall, but not pressing his back against it, and focused on his breathing. He tried to ground himself, pressing his hands to the soothing cold of the metal floor, to push past the agony even the air and shifting of the stiff fabric of his suit caused. He tugged open the rigid collar to let himself breathe. Ilaria sat next to him, her pink eyes shining with tears and arms wrapped around herself, grabbing fistfuls of the lilac folds of her skirt to keep from touching him. "I'm scared," she whispered. Tidus swallowed a lump in his throat and tried to smile at her. "Hey, it's okay," he said. "I'm okay, really. Starting to feel better already." "You were screaming," she said, her voice quavering. "What happened?" Tidus hesitated. She was so little. He didn't want to burden her with what had happened. She didn't need to know. "You said we died," she whispered, and Tidus grimaced. Too late for that, then. He would have to work with what he had. "Yeah, we did, but I fixed it," Tidus said. "See? We're okay." Ilaria nodded and wiped her eyes with her long sleeve. His mother and father stood by the control panel in the wall, talking in hushed voices and sending him glances every few seconds. The pain that coated Tidus' skin started to fade, to level out at least, so he could manage it without being blinded every time he moved. It was replaced by a heavy weight in his stomach, as he could see the flashes of red on the control panel. It wasn't just Kiyun they couldn't contact. It was the whole university. Something was wrong. When they reached the estate, minutes later, Tidus raced after his father as the Baron stormed inside. They went straight to his father's study, where he pulled up a control panel that Tidus had never seen him use before, for emergencies only. The high-security symbol flashed, and his father input a series of codes until it unlocked. Tidus held his breath, praying for his brother to be safe, for him to answer the communication quickly. Kiyun's name flashed on the screen, pulsing as his father sent the signal through. Then it flashed red and disappeared. Tidus let out a strangled cry. "We have to go get him," he blurted out. "Father, we can't leave him there. He'll burn to death. We have to—" "I know," his father snapped, silencing him at once. His father slammed a fist against one of the buttons on the control panel. "Get me a priest, now!" Tidus grabbed the edge of the desk, the corner of it digging into his palm, grounding himself. He counted the minutes in his head. Why hadn't he paid more attention before, the first time around? If the explosion happened the same way it had before, they had 10 minutes left, maybe? Too many minutes passed, and a priest rushed into the room, bowing deeply and hurriedly arranging his pleated, velvety robes. "My lord, what do you need?" he said, looking up at Tidus' father. "The communication lines are down," he said. "We need a spell. Contact my son." "Of course," the priest said. He pushed up his sleeves and held out his hands. His eyelids fluttered, and he muttered prayers to the Emperor, tracing runes only he could see into the air. Tidus held his breath, keeping his own prayers silent. He couldn't distract the priest or interrupt the spell. They were running out of time. Finally, the priest opened his eyes, and they shone with a white light. Between his hands a rippling oval appeared, flashed white, then settled into an image, like a window into another place. And on the other side was Kiyun's confused face, his glasses reflecting the shimmering glow of the spell and obscuring his eyes. "Father? Tidus, what's going on? Why aren't you here?" he asked. Behind him, Tidus could see the shining, newly built walls and equipment of the Cybermed lab. His stomach clenched. "Kiyun, you have to get out of there," he said. "Now!" "You need to come home, son, immediately," his father said. "The ceremony is about to start," Kiyun said. "I can't just abandon my responsibilities here." "Kiyun!" Tidus shouted. "Just get out of there! Come home, then we can explain, I promise! Please, you have to!" Kiyun's face vanished, the light of the spell disappearing in a blink. Tidus looked at the priest, who had an expression of shock spreading over his face. "What happened?" Tidus' father demanded. The priest sputtered, waving his hands in an attempt to start the spell again, but nothing happened. No lights, no rippling in the air. Nothing. "Try again," his father growled, fists clenched at his sides. The priest pushed up his sleeves and started the prayers again, his face scrunched in concentration, and Tidus held his breath. Seconds passed. A minute. "Baron Antirrhinum, I am sorry, but—" the priest stammered. "I can no longer connect to your son. He's gone." "No," Tidus whispered. "No, he can't be." His father slammed his hands against the desk, his shoulders shaking. On the screen, alerts popped up, flashing red and accompanied by loud alarms. Something had happened at the university. Portions of the campus map lit up in red. The Cybermed lab. The explosion. Kiyun was dead. He had failed. Tidus ran from the room, ignoring the shouts from his father and the priest, ignoring the voice of Iris until he got out of the building and into the gardens. He fell to his knees on the cobblestones between the flowers and screamed. His mind was full of static. He had been given a chance nobody else had. The opportunity to reset time, to go back and save his family. And he had wasted it. His brother was dead. Again. Tidus had failed. Sobs racked his body, tears streaming down his face. Kiun was gone. Tidus would never be able to speak to him again, to get his opinion. Never sneak out to the glass dunes in the dead of night, never hear his voice in more than a recording. Tidus was a failure. "Tidus," Ilaria's soft voice broke through the dark clouds inside him, and her hand rested on his shoulder. "Tidus?" "I'm sorry," Tidus sobbed, wrapping his arms around her. "I'm sorry, Ilaria." "Dad said Kiun is—" "I'm sorry." "But Tidus," Ilaria's voice whispered into his ear, "we all died before, right? And you fixed it. You made it better?" Tidus nodded, unable to force more words out. She had trusted him, and he had let her down. He had told her he could fix it, make things better, and it had been a lie. Ilaria pressed her face into his shoulder, and her words were muffled, but distinct, pleading. "Can you try again?" Chapter 4. Tidus knelt with his arms around his little sister, frozen in place. Her plea sank into his bones and made its home there. There was no way he could deny her. She was right. Of course she was right. He could try again. It wasn't over. Not Tidus had said it. If he died, he would enter the timescape and get another chance, a do-over. He had to try again. He was the only one who could save his brother, save his family from this unbearable heartache. And they wouldn't even remember that he had ever failed them. Not if he didn't tell them. Only he would live with that knowledge. "Okay," Tidus whispered, squeezing Ilaria tighter. "I'll try again. I'll save him. I promise." Ilaria sobbed, her entire body shuddering with each intake of air. "Thank you," she cried. "Thank you. I know you can do it. I know you can." Tidus was suddenly relieved he hadn't eaten anything in hours, or he would have vomited right then and there. Ilaria's words were a fleck of warmth against the cold realization of what he had to do. He swallowed the taste of bile. He could do it. It was simple. All he had to do was die. He had to die. It was such a simple thing, but he had never thought about how to do it on purpose, how to kill himself. Even drowning in the timescape wasn't really dying. It was coming back to life. It is better to die once. The scripture hovered at the edge of his mind, and he pushed away the wave of nausea it brought with it. This was different. That was about being selfish, about not accepting the life you were given by the Emperor. Tidus had already died once. The gift he had been given was to be able to do it again. Not to use it would be ungrateful. Tidus would not be a coward. He would honor his gift. He had to make sure it worked, or he wouldn't get to the timescape, and he might miss his chance. He didn't know enough about how it worked. He couldn't waste any time. It had to be today. He had to reset time far enough that he could save Kiun. He could drown himself. Any of the ponds on the grounds would work, but he wasn't sure he could make himself breathe in real water, the way he had done in the timescape. Besides, those were all out in the open. Someone would stop him. Jumping off the roof presented the same problem. The estate had excellent security. The drones would catch him before he even picked up speed. No, it had to be something that couldn't be interrupted. Something fast, decisive. "Ilaria, I'm going to need your help," Tidus said. Ilaria straightened, releasing him from the hug to nod, a look of solemn determination on her face. A stab of guilt almost made Tidus double over again, but he managed to hide it. He would fix this, so she would never have to have that expression land on her features again. "What do I need to do?" she asked. "I'm going to try again, but I need Mom and Dad to not stop me," he said slowly. He wasn't sure she really knew what she was asking of him, what he was going to do, but he didn't want her around to see it, even if she wouldn't remember. "I think it'll scare them if they know I'm going to try again. Can you if Mom and Dad ask where I am, if they're looking for me, tell them I needed some time alone?" Ilaria nodded, her dark curls bouncing with the force of her gesture. Her eyes shone with complete and utter faith in him. Her confidence was unwavering. Tidus would do anything not to disappoint her. "Don't tell them unless they ask," Tidus said, "and don't tell them what I'm doing. Can you do that?" Ilaria nodded, biting her lip. "All right, go on inside," Tidus said. Ilaria gave him one last tight hug, then ran off back inside the estate. Tidus scanned the garden around him. It was empty except for himself and the occasional misting drone. Good. He made his way to the maintenance shed and went inside. Gardening drones lined one wall, manual tools hung from pegs on the other. Jade had always poked fun at this, but Tidus' mother said the practice of gardening was cleansing for the soul. It would certainly prove useful today. Tidus selected a pair of pruning shears, tested the blade by shaving off the small hairs on the back of his arm, then pocketed the tool. It would do the job. Tidus tried to keep his pace slow, even while his heart raced, as he made his way back to his room. He stuck his hands in his pockets to hide the shaking from anyone he walked past, even though they would probably attribute it to the fact his brother had just died. Right. He didn't need to act normal. He needed to act bereaved. Tidus shook his head and slipped into his room. There was no one he needed to perform for in here. Good. Tidus took out the pruning shears and carefully undid the screw holding it together, releasing the halves so he had one very sharp knife. Tidus took a deep breath, trying to steady his hands. He had to be able to do this, and he wanted it to be quick. Tidus gripped the blade tightly and raised it to his neck. His wrists would take too long, but if he could cut into the artery in his neck, it would be over in seconds. Tidus pressed the blade against his neck until he could feel his pulse against the cold metal. He closed his eyes, took a deep breath, released it, then plunged the blade into his throat with all the strength he could muster. It sliced through skin, muscle, and esophagus with a sharp, stinging pain. Tidus tried to gasp, but his severed throat let out a sucking, gurgling sound, and blood spurted across the room. At his reflexive inhale, blood leaked into his lungs. Behind him, Tidus heard the door slide open. No one was supposed to see this. "Tidus, how long will—" Ilaria's question was interrupted by her scream. Tidus turned away, his body already sluggish to respond. But she ran into the room. Her face flashed into view, terrified and spattered with his blood. His vision shorted out, and he felt himself fall as the world tipped out from under him. "I didn't expect to see you back here so soon," a familiar voice said. Tidus tried to breathe, but his throat was sealed shut with the memory of being cut open. His lungs were smothered with the phantom of blood pooling in his chest, spilling down his throat. Tidus reached his hands up to his neck, his eyes flying open as he clawed for air. His hands found nothing, no blood, no wound. But he still couldn't breathe. His body was cold, like he'd fully run out of blood, and his vision shivered and blurred. "Whoa, breathe!" Not Tidus shouted. He grabbed Tidus by the shoulder and pulled him upright, then thumped his fist hard against Tidus' back. Tidus finally gasped, pulling air into his lungs through chokes and heaves. "Seriously, kid, what in the void are you doing here?" Not Tidus demanded. "Had to," Tidus rasped, his voice ragged as his vocal cords remembered being sliced. "Had to fix it." Tidus looked up and saw the older version of his face twist with bewildered horror. "You did this to yourself?" he demanded, his voice stern and uncannily like his father. "Why?" Tidus swallowed and clenched his fists. His shoulders were still trembling. Everything was still cold. He had been so sure about it when Ilaria had pleaded with him to try again, when he had pushed the blade into his flesh, and then he had seen Ilaria's face. Tidus closed his eyes and tried to banish the memory, blood spraying across her as she screamed his name. "I messed up," Tidus croaked. "Kyun, he was still dead. Ilaria, she asked me. I had to try again." "Damn," Not Tidus hissed, then grabbed Tidus by the arm and yanked him to his feet. "I hate to do this, but you've got to pull yourself together." "Ow! Let go!" Tidus yanked his arm, but his older self only tightened his grip. "Remember what I said about the time limit here?" he said. "Well, it gets shorter if you come back too soon, especially before you have any training. You have to go back, now." It was getting hard to breathe again, but this time from the fear gripping his chest. "I didn't know," Tidus stammered. "I thought—" "I know," Not Tidus said, pulling him along through the sand. "I wish I could explain more, but you have got to go. And you said Ilaria asked you to do this?" "I don't think she really understood," Tidus said, her bloodied face flashing through his mind. "I didn't mean for her to see, but it's okay. She won't remember." "Kid," Not Tidus replied, his voice softening finally. "You have to learn to control this, because if she asked you to do this and then saw it, she's going to remember." Tidus felt the blood in his veins turn to ice, and his feet stuck where they were in the sand. "What?" he choked. "No, she can't." "I'm sorry," Not Tidus said. "You still get the new chance, but it's not gonna be easy." "How do I fix it? I don't... She can't remember this. She saw me die." "You can't fix everything." Not Tidus turned away so his face was hidden. "Timecasting is just another kind of skill. You still have to live with the consequences." "I don't want to," Tidus lamented. "I know," Not Tidus said, "but you have to. Make sure you learn from this. Don't make the same mistake twice. And for the love of Prometheus, don't come back here until you get some training." Tidus nodded. He blinked, and the water appeared in front of them, perfectly still, waiting. Not Tidus pushed him in, and the water splashed around his ankles, clinging almost like a syrup, but almost like something alive. Tidus stepped farther in, and then fell forward as Not Tidus pushed him hard from behind. His face hit the water, and Tidus closed his eyes and forced himself to inhale the water. He tried not to remember drowning in his own blood. Chapter 5. Tidus woke to the sound of screaming, and this time it wasn't his own. He couldn't breathe. His hands flew to his throat, and expected it to be sticky with blood, but there was nothing. Tidus opened his eyes and tried to gasp for air. Ilaria ran to him, throwing her arms around his neck and sobbing hysterically. Tidus squeezed her tightly. He tried to speak to reassure her, but nothing came out. His throat burned, and the nerves in his neck writhed with the memory of the blade. The phantom sensation of blood spilling down his throat and into his lungs made him gag, and he still couldn't breathe. Tidus leaned forward, cradling Ilaria in his arms. His parents were speaking now, asking frantic, worried questions, but it all sounded muffled, like he was underwater. Stars and dark splotches danced in his vision. He needed to breathe. Tidus slammed his back against the wall of the shuttle so hard it stung his spine. He gasped for air, finally forcing lungfuls down his throat. "We have to get Kyun," Tidus rasped, his voice ragged. He looked up at his father with watery eyes, squeezing Ilaria tightly against his chest. "We have to get him away from the new lab, or he's going to die." Tidus, I'm sorry, I didn't know." Ilaria continued to sob into him, her tears soaking through his tunic. "I didn't want you to get hurt, too. I'm sorry, please." "Shh, it's okay," Tidus said, rocking her gently. He swallowed hard to try and get his voice back to normal. She wasn't supposed to have seen him die. She wasn't supposed to remember. He stroked her hair gently, glad that at least neither of them was covered in blood now. "I'm okay, see?" Ilaria sobbed harder, burying her face in his chest. "Tidus, what is going on?" his father asked, frowning. I don't know exactly. Just..." Tidus hesitated. "I've seen this before, this day. We died at the ceremony. Please, we have to get Kyun out of there." His father's frown deepened. "What do you mean, you've seen it before?" "I died. Then I was in a place with sand, the timescape," Tidus said. His father had believed him before. There was no reason he shouldn't this time. He just had to get them to save Kyun. "All right, calm down. It's going to be all right." His father's gaze flickered with recognition, with understanding, but his concerned frown remained. "Iris, contact Kyun Antirrhinum." Iris' confirmation chime sounded, and his father reached for Ilaria, putting a hand on her shoulder. "Ilaria, what is the matter?" "It's my fault," Tidus said, looking away. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean for her to remember. The first time we all died, and then the second time." "Second time?" His father's words were sharp, and Tidus flinched, pulling Ilaria closer to him. "What are you talking about?" "It's not your fault," Ilaria said, squeezing Tidus with all of her strength, her face smeared with tears and snot. "I'm the one who asked you to. I didn't know you had to die. I didn't want you to. I didn't mean it." "Tidus," his father said, his tone darker than Tidus had ever heard it before. "What did you do?" Tidus clamped his mouth shut, his eyes locked on his father's, as horror washed over them. All at once, Tidus realized his mistake. Both of his parents' faces were stricken, pale, and horrified. He knew why. Accepting death was accepting the Emperor's will. To circumvent it was a path to corruption, the path of the necromancers. But Tidus wasn't using necromancy. He was using a gift from the Emperor. Prometheus had created this power, so it couldn't be a circumvention of his will to use it. "I had to save him," Tidus whispered. "I have to. I didn't know any other way. I had to die. I had to kill myself for it to work." "What have you done?" his mother shrieked, covering her mouth with her hands. "It's not like I wanted to. I don't enjoy dying," Tidus snapped, anger surging through him. "Please, father, we have to get Kyun." "No." His father grabbed Ilaria and yanked her away from him, making her scream louder. "Iris, turn the shuttle around. Take us back to the Antirrhinum estate." "No!" Tidus shouted and leapt to his feet. "You can't! You're letting him die, father!" "I will not be spoken to in such a manner," Tidus' father snapped. "Have you no respect? It is better to die once. Live a life worthy of honor and enter the light of the Emperor. Would you deny your brother this honor?" "What?" Tidus gasped. "But I can fix it. I've been given a gift. What about that? The gifts of the Emperor are for his glory and not to be suppressed." "Expecting you not to kill yourself is not suppressing you," his father roared. He glared, and Tidus saw a sheen of tears over his eyes. "You had your second chance. That was the will of the Emperor. If he died even after that, it is conceit for us to disagree. It is blasphemy to reject the gift of the Emperor by taking your own life, to put your own will above his." "You don't know the Emperor's will," Tidus said. Rage and anguish flooded his veins. "And yeah, it is better to die once because dying is the worst. But I didn't get that option. If that damns me to the void, I might as well make the most of it." "Insolent child!" his father snarled. The back of his hand smacked against Tidus' face, snapping his head back. "Do not speak of gifts from the Emperor after you have defiled your soul." The hate in his father's words was like poison on Tidus' tongue, sliding down his throat and burning like acid the entire way. "Daddy, please!" Ilaria tugged at their father's sleeve. "Please, just go get Kiun. Don't let him die again." His father turned, the back of his hand hitting Ilaria's face with a loud crack. She stumbled back, eyes wide with shock. "Don't touch her!" Tidus snarled. "Tidus!" his mother snapped. "Haven't you done enough?" Tidus gaped at his mother, who turned her steely gaze away from him to quiet the whimpering Ilaria. "And you brought your sister into your blasphemy," his father hissed. "How could you be so stupid, so selfish?" "Selfish?" Tidus balled his fists. "This isn't selfish. You have no idea what it took to do this. You can't imagine what it's like. Now take us to the university, or you're killing Kiun." Tidus glared at his father, his face stinging sharply from the strike. His father's expression darkened like a storm cloud. "Silence!" he bellowed. "You have done enough, Tidus." "Please, Daddy," Ilaria cried, pulling against their mother's firm grip. "Kiun doesn't have to die. We can still save him." Their father turned away. "I will not let the foolishness of your brother condemn us all." The Baroness pulled Ilaria away, tears streaming from his mother's eyes as she turned away from Tidus. Tidus clenched his fists until his fingernails drew blood. It was all going wrong, even worse than before. They weren't going to save Kiun. And now his father could only look at him with utter revulsion, and his mother couldn't look at him at all. He had made everything worse. Tidus thought for just a moment he could pull the emergency stop lever and jump from the shuttle. He would probably die, get another do-over. But no, his family would see. They would be here, and then they might remember it. Because he still didn't know what he was doing. The estate came into view, and Tidus' father grabbed his upper arm roughly, fingers digging in hard enough to bruise. Tidus winced and tried to pull away, throwing all of his strength and weight against his father's wrenching hold. But it was like trying to pull down a brick wall with his bare hands. "Stop it," he said. "Let go of me." "I can't fathom what would possess you to do something like this," his father growled. The moment the shuttle docked and the doors slid open, his father strode out, dragging Tidus along with him. Even letting himself drop into a dead weight didn't slow the Baron. It only made him yank his arm nearly out of its socket.
"I raised you better than this. The divinators will decide your fate."
"I haven't done anything wrong," Tidus yelled, but his father shook his head.
"If you really believe that, then I have failed as your father," he said. "To think my own son would be arrogant enough to think his own desires could supersede death itself. It is damnation."
"I'm not practicing necromancy. I'm not making a cloak of human faces," Tidus insisted. "I'm not defiling anything. I can make it so Kiyun never died. It's not the same thing." They reached Tidus' room, and his father slid the door open, then threw Tidus in roughly. Tidus caught himself against the desk. He spun around, fists balled at his sides. His father reached over to his shelf and removed the astral globe, a perfect-scale model of the Nora star system encased in glass. The only thing Tidus could have broken to get something sharp enough to kill himself. "Father!" Tidus exclaimed. "Please, just listen to me."
"I have listened plenty,"
his father said. He reached up with his other hand and hefted Tidus' massive copy of the Imperiatus Divinatum and threw it at him. It hit him in the chest, knocking the wind out of him, and Tidus landed on the floor.
Raziel, too, believed he was justified, that he was above the rules.
Tidus scrambled to his feet, but his father slammed the door shut, and the frame blinked red as the lock engaged. "Wait!" he yelled, slamming against the door. "Please, you have to listen!" There was no response, only the sound of his father's footsteps retreating down the hall. Tidus slammed his hands against the door once more, then slid down to his knees. He had failed, even worse this time, he realized again. And what if he was wrong? Had he doomed Ilaria along with himself? He turned his head, and his eyes landed on his ornate, illuminated copy of the Imperiatus Divinatum. It had always been a source of comfort, of guidance. The words of the Emperor himself. "It is better to die once, to live a worthy life and go peacefully into the light of the Emperor. We may mourn for our own loss when others die, but we need not mourn on their behalf if they have lived a life of honor." He knew the passage by heart. There wasn't a child raised on Dothara who didn't. But it wasn't the only scripture there was. It wasn't the only thing that mattered. To serve the Emperor is to sacrifice. It is only through the depths of sacrifice we can reach the ultimate heights of glory. Honor your gifts. Treasure your sacrifices. The Emperor wouldn't have given Tidus this gift if he wanted his brother dead. Obviously, he was supposed to save Kiyun. He wasn't sacrificing his brother. He was sacrificing himself. That was the only way to honor the gift. The Empire wouldn't be better off without Kiyun. After all, he was important. The Empire needed him. Tidus needed him. Tidus took a deep breath and stepped away from his door. He had to try again. He had to get it right this time. There had to be a way. Not Tidus' warning flashed through his mind. Don't come back here until you've gotten some training. If you stay here too long, you lose yourself. You lose what matters and your connection to reality. So he would just have to be quick, not linger in the timescape. He needed one more chance, one more shot to get it right. Then he could focus on getting training. After he had fixed this, he needed to be ready, so that this time he wouldn't mess up. This time he would save Kiyun. He would save everyone. Tidus let out a slow breath and walked into his bathroom. He didn't have a lot of options while he was locked in his room. There was nothing in here sharp enough to kill himself with. He didn't usually need anything like that, and his father had taken the only thing he could have broken to accomplish it. But there was a bathtub. His knees wobbled at the thought of drowning, memories of the time water and his own blood already clogging up his lungs. But it was the only thing that he could get to, and he didn't have any time to waste. He wasn't waiting around for the news that Kiun was dead, not for a third time. Tidus turned on the water and started to fill up the tub. Then he went back into his room and pushed the 2 bookcases in front of his door, then the desk and chair, just in case. He needed as much time as he could get. This had to work. He couldn't let anyone stop him, not even himself. Tidus clenched and unclenched his fists, the fear of drowning almost as overwhelming as the fear of living in this timeline that he had destroyed. He needed a way to keep himself under, to make sure it worked. His gaze landed on the massive tome of scripture, as large as his entire torso. Tidus picked it up and hefted it into the bathroom. He would not be judged by the divinators. No. The Emperor himself would have the final say. He sat on the edge of the tub as the water reached within inches of the rim. His skin had broken out into a cold, clammy sweat, and his hands were shaking. He hugged the Imperiatus Divinatum to his chest, then let himself fall backwards. The water cracked around his head, then closed up over him. Tidus opened his mouth and forced himself to inhale. Water rushed in, smothering, invasive, and heavy. His body reacted, convulsing, panic shooting through his nerves and desperately trying to pull him out. The Imperiatus Divinatum sat heavy on his chest, pressing him down against the involuntary thrashing. He tried to focus. He had to be ready. He couldn't waste time in a panic when time reset. He had to save Kiun. At least Ilaria wasn't here to see it this time. Would she still remember after he reset time? Would he reset it far enough back? If she still remembered seeing him die, he would have to keep her from spilling the information to their parents, or this would all be for nothing. Tidus banged his head against the bottom of the tub, gripping the tome desperately, and kept himself under the water as the lack of oxygen blurred his vision and drained all the energy from his limbs. Save Kiun, he repeated in his mind. Keep it secret and save Kiun. This was it. He was going to die. Darkness rushed in on him, oppressive. The approach of death gripped his heart with ice-cold terror. But it was the only way to get another chance to do things right. He could do this one more time. Chapter 6. Tidus coughed up the feeling of drowning and staggered to his feet in the endless sand of the timescape. He was alone this time. He stumbled forward, forcing himself to walk through the sand. Fear spiked through him as he tried to picture Kiun's face and found it blurry, hazy, like looking at his brother through a sandstorm. Not Tidus had been right. Only moments in the timescape this time, and things were slipping away. He had to get out of here before he lost his mind to the sands of time. Tidus looked up, and the eerily still not sea of the timescape stretched out in front of him. Trembling, Tidus walked in and let the water reach up over his head. He had barely caught his breath from drowning to get here when he breathed in the water, a horribly familiar heavy darkness filling his lungs, and let it pull him back into the flow of time. Tidus woke up, lungs burning, body aching, and mind spinning. He was on the shuttle with his family, on the way to the university. It was eerily silent without the sound of screaming. Tidus lurched forward, stumbling directly into Ilaria, who was stunned and frozen in her seat, face ashen as she stared at Tidus. One look at her eyes and he could tell. She remembered. Tidus grabbed her arm so they fell to the floor together. Tidus coughed and gulped down the tears that burned at his eyes. "Don't let them know you remember," he whispered between gasps. Ilaria gave a jerky nod, her eyes wide. "Tidus, are you all right?" his mother exclaimed, jumping out of her seat. Tidus scrambled to his feet. He clenched his jaw to keep his teeth from chattering, and his eyes watered under the strain of not coughing and gasping. He could feel the memory of the water in his lungs, and prayed his lips weren't blue to give him away. He couldn't risk them turning back. He couldn't leave Kiun to die again. "I'm fine, Mother," he said. I think I fell asleep and fell out of my seat." He looked away as his mother hurriedly checked him for injuries and fixed his clothes and hair. He could feel the condescending disapproval of his father burning into him. The glow of pride from the first reset was completely gone. He would never get it back, but anything would be better than the vile hatred of the last try. Tidus' heart was pounding in his chest as he took his seat. Ilaria stared at him wide-eyed and petrified from across the shuttle. Tidus tried to give her a reassuring smile. He hoped she wouldn't say anything. There was no way he could get more than that one sentence to her without their parents overhearing or growing suspicious. His father watched him the rest of the way to the university, making sure he didn't disgracefully fall asleep again. Tidus avoided his father's gaze by staring past Ilaria out the window. When they arrived, he would have to tell Ilaria what his plan was. He couldn't do it without her. He hated that. He didn't want to drag her into this anymore. But now that she was in it, he didn't know how to let her out. He couldn't undo the memories that she had. His only consolation was that at least she didn't remember her own death. She didn't remember burning alive. The shuttle landed in the grassy landing field just outside the university, and Tidus stood. Ilaria jumped to his side and grabbed his arm, her fingernails digging into his skin. Tidus slowed his pace so that they were a distance behind their parents and whispered to Ilaria, low enough that even the shuttle surveillance wouldn't be able to pick it up. "How much do you remember?" Tidus hissed. "How many times have we?" "2," Ilaria said, her voice trembling. "I remember Dad." Her hand reached up to her face, where their father had hit her. "Okay," Tidus said, cutting her off. That was all he needed to know. "I need your help." Ilaria nodded, her expression hardening, stabbing like a needle to Tidus' heart. "Once we get inside, you need to fake sick, dramatically sick. Keep Mother and Father with you, so I can take care of Kiun. Can you do that?" "I can," Ilaria whispered, her grip on his arm tightening further. "Good," Tidus said, "and remember, they can't know that this isn't the first time." Ilaria's features darkened, and she nodded once more. Tidus swallowed an apology before it could reach his lips. This wasn't the time, no matter how much he hated himself for making Ilaria a part of this. He could apologize all he wanted after Kiun was safe. They followed their parents off the shuttle, his father's security detail falling into step around the family. Tidus used to think they were mostly decorative, a formality. Today, he hoped they wouldn't get in his way. They walked under the massive stone archway and entered the university. Stained glass windows painted the entryway with a tapestry of colored light. Tidus pried Ilaria off his arm, and she wrapped her arms around herself instead, bunching up fistfuls of her gossamer dress. The flow of people around the hall surged towards the new Cybermed lab. Tidus felt a sickening wave of guilt wash over him. How many of these people were about to die? Would any of them be saved? Why couldn't he figure out a way to stop the explosion? If they had been able to warn the university en route, there would have been a chance. But there hadn't been time. Even if he sounded the alarm now, there was too much of a chance Kiun would still die. There would be too much chaos. Tidus shook his head and bit the inside of his cheek to ground himself. He had tried warning them, and Kiun had died anyway. It was too late. Tidus didn't know how to go farther back in the past, so all he could do was try to save his brother. They reached the intersection of 6 hallways, a hexagonal courtyard, and Tidus caught Ilaria's eye. The map in his father's study had shown the damaged area in the first reset. This courtyard was well outside of it. He gave a single nod, and Ilaria screamed. She collapsed to the ground, clutching her stomach and screaming. Tears streaked down her face, which was impressively beaded with feverish sweat. She reached out and grabbed onto the hem of their mother's skirt and their father's jacket. Tidus ducked away, slipping past the guards who joined the concerned swarm around his sister, who turned out to be an incredible actress. Tidus shouldered his way through the crowd, now fighting against the flow of attention. The corner of his gaze caught on a swish of black, red, and gold fabric, and a shiver ran through him. Tidus ducked around the corner and came face to beak with Jade Calyx. She jumped back with a surprised squawk, the feathery frill atop her head poofing out in surprise.
"Whoa! Where are you going, Tidus?"
she said, craning her long neck over his shoulder.
"Is that Ilaria screaming?"
"Jade, I need to find Kiun, right now," Tidus said urgently. If anyone knew the fastest way to his brother, it would be Jade. 2 years older than Tidus, she was the other half of the University Leader airship, Kiun's partner.
"What's going on?"
Jade asked, dipping her head in concern. "I don't have time to explain," Tidus said. "I need to get to Kiun." Jade stared at him, calculating, then nodded. She grabbed his hand and yanked him down a side hall, then placed her hand on the wall. A retinal scanner appeared, and she put her eye up to it. A door Tidus hadn't even known existed shimmered into view and opened.
"Admin shortcut," Jade said, "and you'd better explain after this."
"Sure," Tidus replied, sprinting down the hallway Jade had revealed. She followed, flapping her wings to keep up with him in bursts of speed. "But right now, we just have to get Kiun out of the med lab, as far away from it as we can, as fast as we can."
"Left,"
Jade chirped. Tidus skidded around the corner and almost ran headfirst into another door. He slowed enough for it to open and charged through. "Tidus, what are you doing here?" Kiun asked. The room Tidus had emerged into was small, and the sound of a crowd came from the top flight of stairs across the room. The Cybermed lab. "Come on, you have to come with me, right now," Tidus insisted, grabbing Kiun's arm. Jade burst into the room behind him. "Something is wrong with Ilaria." "What?" Kiun threw a confused look to Jade.
"Well, she was screaming,"
Jade agreed.
"Tidus said—"
Tidus yanked on Kiun's arm until he stumbled towards the exit with him. "We don't have time. Come on." He pulled on Kiun and shoved Jade towards the exit. "Tidus, the ceremony is about to start. I have to—" "The world won't end if you're a few minutes late," Tidus said. "Please, trust me. You need to come." Tidus yanked Kiun the rest of the way through the door and slammed his hand to the button to close it. "Run!" he yelled at the other two, pushing them down the hallway. This startled them into running along the passage and around the corner with Tidus at their heels, urging them on. Kiun slowed, turning with a question in his eyes, and behind them the world shook. A loud boom sounded, and a shockwave surged through the hall, throwing them off their feet. The explosion. They had escaped it. The Cybermed lab explosion had happened, and Kiun was still alive. Tidus collapsed to the ground, mad laughter escaping him. He had done it. They were alive, and he had even saved Jade, too. "What was that?" Kiun yelled. Tidus grabbed his brother's leg as he tried to run back down the hall. "Don't!" Tidus shouted, sitting up. "It's gone, Kiun. There's nothing you can do, please." Kiun turned, looking down at Tidus in confusion and shock. "What's going on? Tidus, how did you—" Tidus got to his feet, looking Kiun in the eye. He could do this. His brother was alive. He had saved him. Now he just had to get through this without letting anyone outside of Ilaria know how many times he had had to try. When we got here, Kiun, I saw something, Tidus said. I saw it happen. The explosion. You would have died. We all would have. Why didn't you raise the alarm? Why didn't you stop the ceremony, evacuate everyone? Kiun yelled, grabbing Tidus by the front of his tunic and shoving him against the wall. I didn't have time. I swear I wanted to save everyone. If I could have, I would have, Tidus pleaded. Please, the explosion happened too soon. I didn't have time. Kiun squeezed his eyes shut, his shoulders trembling, and released Tidus. Sorry, he said. Sorry, I can't. All those people. I know, Tidus murmured, his voice soft. I know. Ilaria, we have to go. Kiun turned stiffly down the hall. Jade, can you? I'll contact the officials. Go see your family, Antirrhinum, Jade said, shooting away with a swish of feathers. Tidus grabbed Kiun's arm to steady him and led him down the hall. His heart was pounding, but with exhilaration instead of pain, terror, and anguish. He had done it. His entire family was alive. What happened to Ilaria? Kiun asked numbly. I don't know, Tidus said. It happened at the same time I saw... Do you think she saw something too? Kiun asked. Tidus swallowed hard. They would have to figure out a lie of some kind. There would be nothing medically wrong with her. I don't know, he said again. I hope she didn't, Kiun said. I hope. Me too, Tidus agreed, uselessly. She remembered. She had seen more than Kiun would ever know. But Tidus would give almost anything to change that. They emerged back in the hexagonal courtyard to chaos. Civilians were being evacuated. Security was swarming everywhere. Tidus and Kiun were swept off as soon as they were spotted, ushered towards a secure side room where Ilaria was waiting. She leapt at Kiun and wrapped him in a hug before the door even closed behind him. You did it, she said. Kiun, you're alive. Yeah, I'm alive, Kiun said, hugging her back. Where are Mom and Dad? Talking to someone official-looking, Ilaria said. She pulled away from Kiun and wrapped her arms around Tidus' neck instead. I knew you could do it, she whispered into his ear. Tidus closed his eyes and hugged her back. What do you mean? Kiun regarded them with a concerned look. Tidus and Ilaria froze, and Tidus opened his eyes to meet Kiun's gaze. What? Ilaria asked, forcing innocence into her voice and releasing Tidus. What do you mean, you knew he could do it? How did you know? Kiun questioned, his expression sympathetic. What did you see? Ilaria stammered, glancing between Kiun and Tidus. Tidus' mind raced for a lie, but what lie would make sense if he came up with it? That would only raise more questions. I knew. I'm sorry. What are you sorry for? Confusion filled Kiun's voice as he dropped to one knee to be eye level with Ilaria. Her lip quivered, and she blinked back tears. It was my fault. I asked him to. Please, don't be mad, Ilaria whimpered. Ilaria, don't, Tidus hissed, lunging forward, but Kiun caught him by the arm. He turned to look at Tidus, his countenance grim. Tidus, he said, what is she talking about? Chapter 7. Tidus stared at Kiun, blood rushing in his ears as the world fell out from under him. Again. He had finally saved Kyun, only for his brother to find out the same thing that had turned his parents against him in the last timeline. Tidus swallowed hard. Kyun would understand. He would be dead if Tidus hadn't done what he did. His brother had to understand. Outside the room they were in, chaos still raged, and the shadows of 2 guards were visible through the frosted glass. There was nowhere to go. No way to get away from this. Not for any of them. Kyun, I can explain, Tidus said, trying to sound calm and authoritative. There's a lot going on. I'm still figuring it out myself, but I've lived this day more than once before. You've lived this day? Kyun repeated, staring blankly at Tidus. Yes. When we all attended the ceremony, we all died in the explosion, Tidus explained. The memory of flames licking away layers of his skin burned through his mind, and he swallowed the taste of bile. And I died and ended up in some place. Some kind of afterlife desert, except when I woke up again, time had reset. I got to try again. You got to try again, Kyun repeated. He sat down hard on one of the chairs in the room. Tidus exchanged a quick glance with Ilaria, who stood wide-eyed and frozen. No doubt the memory of their father's wrath held her in place. I did, Tidus said. I tried to save everyone, to warn everyone, like you wanted me to, but it didn't work. You still died. The color drained from Kyun's face, and his hands shook. Tidus pressed on. I had to try again. Tidus, please don't tell me you... Please, just listen, Tidus begged. I know how it sounds, but this isn't... I have some kind of gift, okay? I don't know what it is, not exactly, not yet, but this must be what it's for. If I can't use it to protect my family, what good is it? But how did you... I had to try again, Tidus said. I had to die. And since I didn't know how to control whatever this is, Ilaria remembers. That's how she knew. Tidus let silence fall between them. Kyun looked down, rubbing his eyes with his fingers, shoulders hunched. Ilaria edged to Tidus' side and grabbed his hand, squeezing tightly. Tidus squeezed back and bit his lip. I'm sorry, Kyun said, his voice rough. That you had to... for me. No, Tidus said firmly. I chose it. I mean, yeah, it wasn't easy. Dying is terrible, but you're worth it. Kyun looked up at him, and his gaze hit Tidus like a thunderclap. It burned like lightning, shooting through Tidus' very soul. Tidus swallowed and took a step back. Are you... Kyun started, then growled and shook his head. Tidus, that's... You're going to have to live with that decision forever. So it's not about if I was worth it. But, listen, Kyun snapped. He stood, pacing in front of them, with his hands clasped behind his back. You're the one who has to live with it, all right? Are you sure that it's going to be worth it forever? Tidus closed his mouth, all his words dying before they reached his tongue. Ilaria squeezed his hand again. Kyun's meaning settled over him heavily. Tidus had been given a gift, but he had failed to effectively use it without killing himself, twice. If he had really been worthy of it, he would have gotten it right the first time. If he couldn't control it better than this, it would be a waste of the Emperor's gift. Wasted on someone who would never be worthy of the Gilded Halls, whose soul would be forfeit to the void for what he had done, unless he could make up for it, unless he could earn it, be worthy of it. I'll make sure, Tidus said quietly. I can do it. I hope so, Kyun said. He looked past Tidus, then straightened just as the door opened. Tidus turned, his brother's words still digging into him. He could do it. He would prove to Kyun that he would be worthy of it. He would make up for his failure, no matter what it took. His mother and father entered the room, followed by a figure in familiar robes of black, red, and trimmed with gold. Tidus knew they would be a heavy silken weave if he touched them. They were the same robes he had worn in the timescape. The woman wearing them was shorter than Tidus' father, but her presence exuded power and danger. Her face and hands were covered with iridescent scales. Her nose was flat between wide-set, reflective eyes that sparkled gold in the light. Tidus caught the edge of golden markings, like tattoos, peeking out the edges of her sleeves and at the base of her neck.
"Children," their father said, "this is Muse of the Omni Tempore."
Tidus' eyes widened, and he quickly bowed, along with Kyun and Ilaria. The Omni Tempore. An Omni Tempore was here, with them, at the university. A member of one of the angelic legions, and not just any angelic legion even, but one of the two most dangerous, only called in to the most dangerous, destructive of wars, to rewind damage and salvage lives for the Empire. Tidus' heart pounded. Was it because of the explosion? Had something apocalyptic started on Dothara? Started at the university? "You may rise," Muse said. When Tidus looked up, he found Muse's eyes staring straight into him. "So you're the new little Timecaster." Her words slammed into Tidus so hard he almost lost his balance. Timecaster. She was talking about him. It clicked into place and felt right. It felt accurate. And she was here for him. Every Timecaster was destined for the Omni Tempore, to serve the Emperor in ways most could only dream of. Tidus swallowed hard. Yes, he said. I think so, at least." "Well, congratulations," Muse said with an ominous smile. "Now, I'm sure you're all concerned about the danger to the university. Rest assured, I have taken care to make sure the danger has passed. We will, of course, be investigating the explosion in your lab, but the rest of the university is safe for the moment, so you may breathe easy." Kyun relaxed next to Tidus, and their father bowed low.
"Thank you,"
the Baron murmured.
"Your presence here is truly a blessing."
"It is," Muse said. "As for your son, his training must begin immediately. We have already collected his things from your estate." Tidus clamped his mouth shut to keep from gaping at that. But it made sense. They held mastery over time. Of course they could collect his things, and be ready for him less than an hour after he had reset time. He had probably barely avoided them before by killing himself. Ice shot through his veins. Did they know? He stared at Muse. Did she know what he had done? "I will allow you a few minutes for your goodbyes," Muse said graciously. "Tidus Antirrhinum, you will join me at docking bay 7 in 15 minutes, and we shall depart." "Yes, ma'am," Tidus said, bowing again. The corner of Muse's mouth twitched in a smile, and she turned and left the room, not even giving an acknowledgment to his parents in her departure. Her position in society was far enough above them that she didn't have to. "Tidus, we're so proud of you," his mother said, rushing forward and wrapping him in a hug. Tidus hugged her back stiffly, and his gaze locked onto his father. Tears shone in his eyes, but not tears of loss. This time, they were tears of pride. Tidus shivered, remembering a different look in his father's eyes, a look of hate, revulsion. Utter disappointment and shame. That was the look he had received when his father knew the truth. He had only earned the pride with a lie he couldn't maintain with the Omni Tempore even if they didn't already know. Would they condemn him too? Would they hate him? What would they do to him if he had already committed a terrible wrong? "I'm scared," Tidus confessed quietly. His own honesty surprised him, but he couldn't make himself take it back or cover it up. He was scared, petrified. "I'm sure this is all very scary," his father said gently, compassionately, ignorantly. "But I know you're going to be all right." "How can you be so sure?" Tidus didn't mean to sound so cynical, but he couldn't keep the bitterness from his voice. His father had no idea what it felt like to die, what it meant to be a Timecaster. Tidus barely knew himself, and it was already almost more than he could bear. "Because, Tidus, no matter what, we will always be here for you," his father said. That almost made Tidus laugh. He already knew it wasn't true. He had seen it. He knew exactly what he could do to cause his father to reject him completely. In fact, he had already done it. His only hope was that his father never found out. Tidus looked back at Kiun, but his brother wouldn't meet his gaze. Ilaria stared at him with wide, pink eyes brimming with tears, then ran over to him and wrapped him in a hug. "I'm going to miss you so much," she whispered. "I love you." Tidus hugged her back, smoothing out her curls with one hand. "Me too," he said. "I'm going to miss all of you." "Promise you'll write to me every day," Ilaria demanded. Tidus smiled. "I'll write as often as I can," he vowed, "but I don't know how busy I'll be." Ilaria sighed and released him from the hug so she could cross her arms and pout at him. "Fine," she said. "Well, I guess I should get going," Tidus said. Trepidation filled his entire body. Only this morning. Had it only been this morning? He had only hoped to be able to get into the university, to get that look of pride from his father with his academic proposal. Now he had garnered that look, that pride, and he was leaving the planet entirely. And now it was a lie, tainted. And Tidus could never reveal the truth. Outside, the chaos had died down as the civilians had been directed elsewhere, casualties already taken to the campus hospital. All that was left in the corridors on the way to the docking bay was security, scattered debris, and dropped possessions, ghosts of the tragedy. Ilaria clung to his arm the entire way, only releasing him when they came within view of Muse. Her presence set all of Tidus' nerves on edge, made his gut scream at him to run, that she was dangerous. Instead, he walked towards her and kept his head held high. The door to the shuttle slid open as Muse turned, swishing her cloak with the motion and headed inside. Tidus hurried to follow, casting a final glance at his family. The doors closed, separating them with a final click. Muse's voice entered his mind, echoing strangely, directly into his thoughts. "Let's go find out if you can survive meeting your destiny."